border colony lay under a dark red sky as the storm raged for the 5th day. Wind howled through broken towers and shattered metal drifted across empty streets. Families huddled in basements with little food or clean water as the power grid had failed. The medical center was in ruins, and the colony's main comms array was nothing more than a twisted skeleton of wires and steel. Jack Carter stood on the cracked steps of what used to be the freight hub. He was just 17, tall for his age but thin from the weeks of shortage. His hands were raw from hauling crates of supplies that were running out faster than anyone could replace them. His parents had died 2 days earlier when part of the old roof collapsed. He had buried them behind the storage yard in silence, because there had been no one left to say the words. Most of the colony believed no help was coming, or signal had been lost before the storm hit. Traders avoided this sector, and the nearest kingdom was weeks away. But then, on the morning of the 6th day, the clouds tore apart with a roar that shook the ground. A fleet of ships dropped from the upper atmosphere, their engines cutting through the noise of the storm. At the head of the convoy was a sleek royal transport painted in deep blue with the crest of Queen Margaret's kingdom. The ship landed in the central square, crushing fallen debris under its heavy landing struts. Soldiers in polished armor stepped out first, their shields raised against the wind, followed by medical officers carrying crates marked with the seal of the crown. Queen Margaret herself walked down the ramp, her cloak snapping in the storm wind. She was tall, with sharp eyes and a voice that cut through the chaos. She ordered the soldiers to begin securing the streets, clearing paths to the medical center, and setting up power generators. She spoke to the colony's few remaining leaders, not as a ruler above them, but as if she were speaking to her own people. Jack watched from the freight hub steps as the soldiers unloaded food packs and fresh water. For the first time in days, the air smelled of something other than dust and burnt wiring. He stepped forward when one of the medics called for anyone injured. A cut ran along his forearm from carrying jagged metal, and it had grown swollen and red. The medic cleaned it and wrapped it in clean bandages, speaking in a calm voice. Jack could hardly remember the last time someone had spoken to him like that. For 3 weeks, the Queen's people stayed. Engineers repaired the broken power lines, replacing twisted beams and burned-out circuits. The generators roared to life, sending a low hum across the colony. Medical staff moved from home to home, treating wounds and sickness. The soldiers rebuilt the comms array so the colony could call for help again if danger returned. Each night, in the large storage building that had been cleared of rubble, the Queen met with survivors. She listened to their stories, asked what they needed most, and made sure the supply ships kept coming. She did not act as if she had done something extraordinary. To her, it was simply the right thing to do. Jack found himself working with the engineers. They taught him how to replace damaged wiring, how to brace structures against high wind, and how to balance a generator load. It was the first time he had learned anything that might give him a future beyond just surviving from one day to the next. On the last day, the Queen stood on the ramp of her ship and spoke to the gathered crowd. She told them they would not be forgotten, that her kingdom considered them under its protection now. Her voice carried strength, but her eyes were warm. When she turned to leave, Jack stepped forward without thinking. He told her his name and thanked her for saving their lives. She nodded once and said quietly, so that only he could hear, that sometimes a small act can change the shape of the future. He did not understand what she meant then, but he remembered every word. As the ships rose into the sky and the sound of their engines faded into the distance, Jack made himself a promise. If the Queen ever needed help, if her kingdom ever stood in danger, he would not hesitate. He would answer that call no matter how far he had to go or what it cost him. He would not forget the day she came. 10 years had passed since the storm on the border colony, but Jack Carter remembered it as if it had happened yesterday. He had grown from a boy into a man, working his way up from a small cargo pilot to the owner of a modest fleet of freight haulers. His ships ran supplies between distant stations, often taking jobs others refused. Life on the edge of human space was dangerous, but Jack had learned to survive in places where rules meant nothing and only skill kept you alive. One night, while unloading crates at a dusty outpost, Jack overheard 2 traders talking in hushed voices. Their words made his stomach turn cold. Queen Margaret's kingdom was under attack. A massive force had swept through her border worlds. Breaking defenses and surrounding the core planets, invaders demanded surrender within a week. promising to destroy the capital if she refused. Jack felt his chest tighten. He had not spoken to the Queen since that day long ago, but he owed her everything. The thought of her kingdom falling filled him with a burning anger. He left the outpost before dawn, piloting his ship through the black void toward a hidden relay station where news traveled faster than official channels. The reports there confirmed the rumors. The Queen's armies were fighting hard, but they were outnumbered and exhausted. The enemy was pushing closer to the capital each day. Civilians were being evacuated, but many had nowhere to go. Jack leaned against the cold metal wall of the relay station and thought of the promise he had made as a boy. He had not forgotten. He never would. Without hesitation, he began sending messages to old contacts, miners he had worked with in the frozen belts, captains who owed him favors, engineers who remembered the Queen's aid during past disasters. Most of them lived scattered across space, far from the fight, but when they heard the name Margaret, they listened. In the following days, Jack traveled from system to system, gathering people who shared his debt. There was Claire, a freighter pilot whose crew had been rescued from a burning station years ago by the Queen's forces. There was Daniel, a ship mechanic who had been fed and sheltered during a famine in her territory. There was Nathan, a quiet miner who had lost his family and found refuge in the Queen's lands. Each one had their own story of how she had saved them, and each one agreed to fight. Jack knew they were not an army. They were traders, miners, smugglers, and wanderers. But they were survivors, and survivors fought differently. They had seen hard times and learned to adapt. They knew how to strike fast and vanish before the enemy could react. With his savings and the pooled resources of his allies, Jack began turning their ships into weapons. Cargo haulers were fitted with reinforced hulls. Mining drills were converted into railgun platforms. Salvaged armor plates were bolted over fragile sections of their hulls. While his growing fleet prepared, Jack sent scouts to learn more about the enemy positions. The reports were grim. The Queen's forces had been pushed back to a defensive line just outside the capital system. The enemy's main fleet was huge, armed with heavy warships and siege platforms. Every official channel said it was only a matter of time before the line broke. But Jack refused to accept that. Each night, as the fleet gathered in a hidden asteroid field, he would stand before the crews and speak. He told them of the day the Queen came to save his colony, of the way she walked through the storm without fear, and how she stayed until every life she could save was saved. He told them that they were here because she had once been there for them, and that now it was their turn. By the end of the week, nearly 24 ships floated in the asteroid shadows, engines cold to avoid detection. They were mismatched, patched together from different designs, but each bore the old crest of the Queen's kingdom, painted roughly on the hull. Jack stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dawnrider, and looked out at the fleet. It was not large, but it was ready. In the silence of space, his voice came over the comms. He told them they would strike at the heart of the enemy siege, and they would not stop until the Queen was free. There was no applause, no cheers only, the steady reply of voices saying they were ready. Jack took a deep breath and gave the order to move. The fleet's engines flared to life, and the ships slipped from the asteroid field into the black. The fight for the Queen had begun. The black of space stretched endless around them as Jack Carter's fleet moved toward the capital system. Their ships were slow compared to military warships, but they kept formation, silent and steady. Each pilot knew the risks. They were about to attack a force larger and better armed than anything they had faced before. Jack stood on the bridge of the Dawnrider, eyes fixed on the star charts glowing on the console. The scouts had returned with fresh information. The enemy fleet had formed a tight siege ring around the capital world, leaving only a narrow gap on the far side where supply ships came and went. Jack's plan was simple. It would use that gap to get inside, strike hard, and break the siege from within. Messages from the fleet came in one after another. Claire reported her freighter's railguns were ready. Daniel confirmed the modified engines on his ship could outrun most heavy cruisers. Nathan's mining vessel carried extra armor plating and heavy drills ready for close-range combat. Every captain had prepared their crew for a fight to the last. As they traveled, Jack made time to speak to each crew over private channels. He reminded them why they were here, speaking of the day the Queen had saved lives without asking for anything in return. He told them she had not hesitated then, and neither could they now. There was no speech to inspire glory, only the truth that they owed a debt. And this was the moment to pay it. When the fleet reached the edge of the capital system, they killed their engines and drifted in the shadow of a large moon. The siege ring was visible on long-range sensors, wall of enemy ships, bristling with weapons. The gap they planned to use was small, guarded by patrols, but it was their only chance. Jack called the captains together on a secure channel. They planned the attack in silence, each person speaking only when they had something important to add. The plan required perfect timing. It would enter the gap during a scheduled supply run, hiding among the incoming freighters. Once inside the ring, half the fleet would target the siege platforms, while the rest moved straight toward the capital to reinforce the Queen. This defenders. The next hours were tense. The fleet floated in darkness, waiting for the moment. Jack checked the weapons systems on the Dawn Rider himself, moving from station to station. The crew worked without complaint, faces hard with focus. They all knew there was no turning back. Finally, the moment came. Enemy patrols moved aside as a convoy of supply freighters approached the gap. Jack gave the order, and their ships powered up in perfect sync, slipping into the formation like shadows. For several minutes they drifted forward, undetected. Then a patrol ship veered too close. Its sensors caught something unusual, and alarms flared across the comms. Jack didn't wait. He ordered all ships to break formation and engage. Engines roared to full power and weapons fired in a sudden storm of light. Claire's freighter blasted the patrol ship to pieces before it could call reinforcements. Daniel's ship darted past two enemy corvettes, railguns tearing through their hulls. Nathan's mining vessel rammed a blockade frigate, drills chewing into its armor until it split apart. The fleet surged through the gap, scattering the smaller enemy ships. The siege ring's main guns began to track them, but it was too late. Jack's group had already split into two forces, just as planned. Explosions lit the void as siege platforms fell one by one. The defenders on the capital world saw the chaos and began pushing outward, striking the siege from the inside. Jack's half of the fleet cut through the enemy's supply lines, leaving burning wreckage in their wake. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, the enemy's perfect control of the battlefield was broken. As the battle raged, Jack looked out at the flashing lights of weapons fire and thought of the day the Queen had walked through a storm to help his people. He'd promised himself he would answer her call, and without her even asking, he had come. Jack Carter stood at the edge of the royal hall, the air heavy with the scent of burned stone and fresh flowers. The hall was filled with people's soldiers in worn armor, engineers with grease on their hands, farmers and traders who had come to see the one who had saved their queen. Sunlight poured through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the cracked marble floor. Queen Margaret entered, her steps slow but steady. She wore no crown, only the same cloak she had worn during the battle, marked with ash and dust. When she reached Jack, the crowd grew silent. She looked into his eyes and spoke with a voice that carried through the hall. She told him she remembered the boy he once was, and she would never forget the man he had become. Jack answered that she had saved him when no one else would, and this was his way of giving back. There was no grand ceremony, no speeches. The Queen clasped his hand, and the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed against the walls. Children ran forward to offer bread and fruit to the crews from his fleet. Strangers embraced as if they had known each other all their lives. The kingdom felt whole again, not because the war was over, but because they had stood together. For days after, Jack and his people worked beside the Queen's forces, rebuilding homes, clearing debris, and repairing ships. Laughter returned to the streets, mixed with the sound of hammers and engines. No one spoke of payment. It was all done because it needed to be done. Word of what happened traveled far. Traders in distant stations told the story of a fleet that appeared from nowhere and shattered a siege. Veterans in other worlds spoke of debts repaid with steel and fire. They said that humans never forgot those who helped them, and their thankfulness could move armies. When the time came to leave, the Queen walked with Jack to his ship. She pressed a small medallion into his palm and told him it was not a reward but a memory to carry. He promised that if her kingdom ever needed him again, he would return without hesitation. As his ship rose into the sky, the people watched in silence. They knew they had seen something rare, something worth telling for generations. Among the stars, Jack felt the weight of the promise in his hand, and the truth in his heart. Some debts can never be forgotten, and some acts of gratitude can change the fate of worlds. The capital world lay under a calm sky for the first time in weeks. The fires had been put out, and the sound of battle was gone. Jack Carter's fleet rested in orbit, their hulls scarred and blackened from the fight. On the surface, the city's streets were crowded with people who had come to see the ones who had broken the siege. Jack walked down the ramp of the Dawn Rider, his boots touching the cracked stones of the main square. Queen Margaret stood waiting, her cloak still marked with ash, her crown absent. She stepped forward alone, the crowd parting for her. There were no guards between them. She looked him in the eye, her expression steady, and thanked him in front of her people. Her words were not formal, they were sharp and clear, filled with the weight of someone who knew exactly what had been done for her. Jack simply replied that long ago she had saved his world, and this was his way of returning that debt. People began to cheer, the sound rolling across the square. Children carried baskets of bread and water to the weary crews. Miners from the fleet shook hands with city engineers, already speaking of how to repair the ships. There was no talk of reward. Everyone understood why they were here. In the days that followed, Jack's people stayed to help. They cleared rubble from the streets, restored power to the darkened districts, and moved supplies to the wounded. Strangers worked side by side as if they had known each other all their lives. The city slowly began to breathe again. News of the battle spread fast. Traders in far-off ports told of the small fleet that had torn through a siege. Soldiers on other worlds spoke of how debts, even after years, could bring people together with a force that no army could match. The message was the same everywhere. Humans never forgot those who had helped them. And when they repaid that help, they did it in a way that could change the course of history. When the time came to leave, the Queen walked with Jack to the base of the Dawn Rider's ramp. She placed a small medal in his hand, telling him it was not for display, but as a reminder of what had been done. Jack closed his fingers around it and promised that if she ever faced danger again, she would not have to call. He would come. The ships lifted off one by one, engines glowing against the darkening sky. The people watched in silence until they disappeared among the stars. On the bridge of the Dawn Rider, Jack looked out into the black and felt the truth of what had just happened. Some promises never fade, and some acts of gratitude are strong enough to shake worlds.